Hey guys, welcome back to another long, slow wander through history's most awkward disasters. Tonight, we're dimming the lights, fluffing the pillows, and quietly heading into the 16th century, where love, politics, and religion mix together about as well as wine and gunpowder. Because tonight, we're talking about the most cursed wedding in royal history. A wedding so catastrophically unlucky that it started as a celebration and ended in, well, a massacre. So, get comfortable, maybe grab a snack, or don't, because this story involves a lot of unpleasant dinner guests. We're going to France, 1572. The bride, a princess. The groom, a Protestant prince. And the guests? Let's just say most of them wouldn't live to send thank you notes. The setting, France, beautifully on fire. Our story unfolds during one of Europe's least relaxing centuries. The 1500s were basically the extended family feud version of Game of Thrones, except everyone's inbred, no one showers, and half the cast dies of smallpox halfway through. France at this time was an especially charming nightmare. Catholics and Protestants, called Huguenots in France, had been politely trying to murder each other for years. There were wars, riots, and the occasional impromptu stabbing in the name of God. So when the young King Charles IX decided that maybe a nice royal wedding could help patch things up, everyone collectively nodded and said, sure, what could go wrong? The bride, Marguerite de Valois, a walking political alliance. Enter Marguerite de Valois, or Margot, as her friends called her, when they weren't busy plotting her marriage. She was the sister of the king, daughter of the late Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, which means she had the unfortunate honor of being born into one of history's most chaotic families. Marguerite was educated, elegant, and by all accounts, very pretty. Though that didn't help much in a family where your looks could be weaponized for diplomacy. Her mother, Catherine de' Medici, basically ran the French court like a chessboard, and Marguerite, she was one of her best pieces. Now, if you've ever thought your parents meddled too much in your love life, just imagine being Marguerite. Every time she made eye contact with someone, there was probably a political treaty forming in the background. She had once fallen in love with the Duke of Guise, which, politically speaking, was like trying to date your country's arch-rival. Catherine immediately shut that down. Instead, Marguerite was told she would marry Henry of Navarre, a Protestant. Yes, that kind of Protestant. The kind her family had been at war with for the better part of a decade. Catherine's reasoning was simple. If Catholics and Protestants were tearing the kingdom apart, maybe a royal marriage could glue it back together. It was basically the 16th century version of, if we just have dinner together, maybe we'll stop hating each other. Spoiler, they did not stop hating each other. The groom, Henry of Navarre, reluctant peacemaker. Henry of Navarre was 20, clever, ambitious, and very much Protestant. He'd grown up surrounded by religious wars and probably spent most of his youth dodging assassination attempts like it was a national sport. His family ruled the small kingdom of Navarre, tucked between France and Spain, which mostly served as a buffer zone for bigger powers to trample through. By the time he arrived in Paris for the wedding, he knew he was walking into enemy territory. The capital was overwhelmingly Catholic, and rumors about the heretic groom spread faster than plague gossip in a medieval tavern. But politics demanded smiles. So Henry smiled, Catherine smiled, Marguerite smiled, Everyone smiled, like they were at a hostage negotiation. The big day, August 18th, 1572. And then came the wedding day. It was August in Paris, which meant the air smelled like heat, horse dung, and religious tension. The ceremony took place outside Notre Dame Cathedral because Henry wasn't allowed inside, being Protestants and all. So imagine the royal bride standing at the cathedral doors in her jewels and silt, and the groom waiting outside, like some very confused wedding guest who got the address wrong. The archbishop refused to bless Henry. Marguerite was basically forced to nod at the altar to signify consent, while her brother, King Charles, allegedly had to push her head down to make her say yes. Romantic, right? The festivities that followed were lavish, expensive, and cursed from the start. The guest list was a who's who of Europe's most judgmental nobles. Catholics, Protestants, and plenty of people who secretly hoped the others would choke on their roast pheasant. Still, for a few days it all seemed fine. Wine was poured, dances were danced, political enemies pretended to be civil. It was France's brief, awkward version of peace. The accident that sparked the fire. Then, because every good royal wedding needs a twist, someone tried to assassinate Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the most prominent Protestant leaders attending the event. He was shot in the street, the bullet shattering his arm, but somehow missing his life. Now, the timing of this was, let's say, suspicious. It happened just days after the wedding, while thousands of Huguenots were still in Paris for the celebration. Rumors spread instantly that Catherine de' Medici herself had ordered the hit. She denied it, of course, but Catherine denying political violence is kind of like a cat denying it knocked something off the table. You know what happened. The Protestant nobles were furious, but didn't yet suspect what was about to unfold. They stayed in Paris, demanding justice, not realizing they were about to become the justice. Catherine's late-night meeting. So let's drift over to the royal palace, where Catherine allegedly held a quiet midnight meeting with her son, King Charles IX. Charles was in his early 20s, already unstable, and the kind of monarch who shouldn't be left alone with sharp objects or power. He was known for mood swings, nervous breakdowns, and occasional screaming fits that probably terrified the palace dogs. Catherine, always the strategist, supposedly convinced him that the Huguenots were plotting revenge for the attempted assassination. She argued that if they didn't strike first, the Protestants would rise up and kill the royal family. And because Charles wasn't exactly the poster child for calm reasoning, he panicked and agreed. The order was simple: eliminate the Protestant leadership. Quietly, efficiently. Except, of course, that's not what happened. The night turns red. The massacre began before dawn on August 24th, 1572, the feast of St. Bartholomew's Day. Church bells rang through Paris. Soldiers and Catholic mobs surged into the streets, their orders suddenly far less surgical, and far more murder everyone with a Bible in French. Admiral Coligny was dragged from his bed and thrown out the window. His killers cut off his head because apparently that felt like extra confirmation he was dead. From there, the violence spread like wildfire. Doors were broken down. Men, women, and children, anyone suspected of Protestant sympathies, were slaughtered. Bodies piled up in the Seine River. And remember, all this started as a wedding celebration. Guests who had come to dance ended up running for their lives through the same streets where they'd been toasting 2 days earlier. Marguerite's horrifying awakening. As for the bride, Marguerite de Valois woke up to the sound of screaming. According to her own memoirs, she had just fallen asleep when a man covered in blood burst into her bedroom, pursued by soldiers. He begged for her protection, and she hid him under her bed while the guards stormed in. They killed several men right there in her room. And Marguerite, still in her nightgown, still technically a newlywed, stood in shock, trying not to faint. It's safe to say her honeymoon was officially ruined. Meanwhile, her husband, Henry of Navarre, was dragged before the king and given a choice: convert to Catholicism or die. He chose conversion, mostly because being alive seemed like a better long-term option. He spent the next few years as a guest, read prisoner, of the French court. The aftermath: France eats itself again. By the time the killing stopped, thousands were dead. Estimates vary wildly, from 3,000 to over 30,000 across France, depending on which terrified witness you asked. The Seine reportedly ran red with blood. Bodies were dumped in rivers, streets, and cellars. The air reeked of death, and even by 16th century standards, that's saying something. When news spread to other cities, more massacres followed. It was like the worst chain reaction in human history, except the spark was a wedding cake. And the message was clear: religious tolerance had officially left the chat. The marriage that somehow survived. Against all odds, Marguerite and Henry both lived. Their marriage, though, was about as affectionate as a business merger gone wrong. Marguerite despised Henry's infidelities. Henry despised being trapped in the Louvre. Eventually, after years of political chaos, Henry escaped, renounced his forced Catholicism, and led Protestant forces back into war. Later, he would reconvert again with the famously pragmatic quote, "Paris is well worth a mass." Because when you've survived your own cursed wedding, religion starts to feel negotiable. As for Marguerite, she was eventually separated from Henry, exiled for her own political scheming, and spent decades writing her memoirs, probably with the world's biggest told you so energy. The stain that never faded. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, as it came to be known, became one of the most infamous events of the Renaissance. It shattered what little peace France had and deepened the hatred between Catholics and Protestants for another generation. Even the Pope reportedly celebrated the massacre with a special mass. Because if you ever needed proof that religion and empathy were having a bad century, that was it. And that wedding, what was supposed to be a symbol of unity, became a historical punchline. The cursed marriage that tried to unite France by accidentally setting it on fire. Let's float on a little further. Because as tragic as that story is, it wasn't exactly unique. Royal weddings have a long, proud tradition of being catastrophes. Sometimes it's betrayal, sometimes it's disease, sometimes it's literal explosions. In part 2, we'll drift toward another doomed celebration, one that took place hundreds of years later, when a royal wedding parade in Spain ended with fireworks, flowers, and a very unexpected bomb. So stay relaxed and let's quietly wander from one cursed wedding to the next. Hey again? Still here? Good. Let's keep drifting, gently, quietly, into another royal catastrophe that should have been a celebration. This time, we're floating forward 3 centuries to 1906, to the bright streets of Madrid, Spain. A time when monarchs still waved to their subjects from horse-drawn carriages, and people still thought assassins wouldn't show up to weddings. Because tonight's story is about King Alfonso XIII of Spain and his British bride, Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a wedding that started with diamonds, flowers, and military fanfare, ended with body parts on the cobblestones. It's fine. Everyone smiled for the photos anyway. So, if you're comfortable, let's quietly travel there now. Madrid, late May, 1906. The sun is shining, the bells are ringing, and the smell of gunpowder is just around the corner. The groom, King Alfonso XIII, born into a job he didn't apply for. Our groom, Alfonso XIII, had technically been king since birth, literally. His father, Alfonso XII, had died before he was born, which is about as early as you can start your royal duties. So when baby Alfonso entered the world, they wrapped him in silk, handed him a crown, and declared him king. Congratulations, newborn, you now run a country that's been in and out of civil wars for decades. Growing up, Alfonso was everything you'd expect from a royal raised in a bubble of wealth and national instability. Charming, arrogant, deeply patriotic, and utterly convinced the monarchy was Spain's divine destiny. He also had a thing for women, lots of them, and a casual disregard for subtlety. In short, the man was a walking tabloid headline, a kind of early 20th century royal influencer who never stopped smiling for the camera. By his 20s, everyone in Europe agreed that Alfonso needed to get married. Ideally, to someone who could give him heirs, make him look respectable, and, if possible, not start another war. So his mother, Queen Maria Cristina, began scouting brides the old-fashioned way, through letters, portraits, and whispered gossip. The bride, Victoria Eugenie, a British princess with terrible luck. Enter Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, better known as Anna. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, which automatically made her 40% more royal and 60% more genetically compromised than the average human being. Anna was pretty, blonde, polite, and, let's be honest, very British, which means she had excellent posture, a healthy respect for rules, and a family tree that could double as a warning label for hemophilia. That last part will be important later. Because when you're marrying into European royalty, you don't just get the jewels and castles, you also get the medical complications. Anyway, Alfonso met Anna while visiting England. He liked her immediately. She, apparently, found him charming in that chaotic way only European royals can pull off, half dashing, half unstable. They wrote letters, they smiled at diplomatic dinners, and before long, Alfonso proposed. It should have been perfect, except Spain wasn't thrilled. Spain's opinion: she's Protestant, she's foreign, and she's cursed. When the engagement was announced, the Spanish press reacted like someone had suggested replacing the cathedral with a casino. A Protestant bride for a Catholic king in Spain? People were outraged. Cartoonists mocked her. Priests denounced her. Even the street vendors probably had opinions. Anna, to her credit, agreed to convert, because love, or at least royal obligation, conquers all. But that didn't help her popularity. Rumors followed her everywhere. Some said she was bringing British spies into the palace. Others whispered about the curse of Queen Victoria's descendants, hemophilia, the royal family's tragic genetic gift that made minor injuries potentially fatal. Still, Alfonso insisted. He wanted her. And so, despite everyone's concerns, the wedding was set for May 31, 1906. The ceremony, a parade of perfection, almost. On the morning of the wedding, Madrid was radiant. The streets were lined with banners, flowers, and about half the population of Madrid. City's population. Soldiers paraded in gleaming uniforms, carriages glided past cheering crowds, and the air was thick with music and optimism. It was, in every sense, a royal spectacle. Part fairy tale, part military parade, part national therapy session. Ina looked stunning. Her wedding gown was embroidered with silver and pearls, her veil a masterpiece of lace. Alfonso, in full dress uniform, looked like he'd stepped straight out of a patriotic painting. Even the weather cooperated, as if the universe briefly decided to pretend Spain was stable. The ceremony took place at Madrid's church of San Jerónimo el Real, followed by a grand procession through the streets toward the royal palace. Every balcony overflowed with spectators waving flags. It was the perfect PR moment, young, glamorous monarchs uniting a nation. And for about 10 minutes, it actually worked. The bomb, when confetti wasn't the only thing falling. Now imagine the scene. The royal carriage is rolling slowly through the Calle Mayor, surrounded by soldiers, flowers, and applause. People are shouting, "Viva el Rey! Viva la Reina!" It's a postcard come to life. And then, right above them, someone throws a bouquet. Except, it's not a bouquet. It's a bomb. The assassin, Matteo Moral, had rented a room in a nearby building specifically to get a perfect view of the parade. He disguised the bomb inside a flower bouquet and tossed it down as the carriage passed. The explosion tore through the crowd. Glass shattered. Horses panicked. Bodies fell. The carriage was dented and spattered with blood, but somehow Alfonso and Ina survived. In a single instant, the most joyful event in Spain became one of the bloodiest. 23 people died, scores were wounded, and the street, moments earlier filled with confetti, was now littered with torn uniforms and broken flags. The royal reaction: smile, you're still king. Now, you might think that after such an event, the wedding would be called off, or at least postponed for trauma reasons. But no, this was monarchy. Optics mattered. So Alfonso, probably still dazed and slightly deaf from the blast, helped Ina out of the carriage, brushed the dust off his medals, and carried on to the palace. There, they appeared on the balcony, pale, trembling, but smiling, because apparently public image outranks shock. According to eyewitnesses, Ina fainted shortly afterward, which is both understandable and impressively restrained, given that she had just been nearly blown up on her wedding day. As for the assassin, Matteo Moral, he fled the scene, only to be caught 2 days later. He was either shot by police or shot himself. It depends which report you believe. Either way, Spain's honeymoon with optimism ended as quickly as it began. The honeymoon. What honeymoon? So what do you do after your wedding gets bombed? Apparently, you go on a honeymoon anyway. The royal couple traveled to the French Riviera because if you're traumatized and rich, the Mediterranean is always plan B. They posed for photographs, smiled through receptions, and tried to pretend that the smell of explosives hadn't followed them there. But the shadow of that day never really left. Ina, already nervous in her new role, found herself blamed by many Spaniards for bringing bad luck. They called her La Inglesa, the English woman, and whispered that her presence had cursed the king. It wasn't fair, of course, but fairness was never royalty's strong suit. The curse continues, the hemophilia problem. If the bombing wasn't bad enough, the marriage had another ticking time bomb, genetics. When their first son, Alfonso, because royals love recycling names, was born, doctors discovered he had hemophilia, the same condition that had haunted Queen Victoria's descendants. It meant that even a small cut could be fatal, and that the royal family's future was now biologically fragile. Alfonso XIII reportedly took the news badly. He loved his wife, but he also blamed her, personally, for the tainted bloodline. It's worth noting that Alfonso's concept of science was roughly whatever makes me feel less guilty, so logic wasn't exactly part of the conversation. Their relationship deteriorated quickly. He had affairs, she withdrew. They kept up appearances, of course, because nothing says royal duty like smiling beside your cheating husband while the newspapers speculate about your cursed womb. Spain itself sliding toward disaster again. Meanwhile, Spain was, as usual, falling apart. The monarchy faced increasing unrest, Republican uprisings, worker strikes, and the occasional military mutiny. Alfonso tried to play the modern king, charming the public with parades and technology, but his reign increasingly looked like one long dress rehearsal for exile. By the 1930s, Spain had finally had enough of monarchy. Alfonso fled the country in 1931, his crown intact, but his popularity in ruins. Ina followed him into exile, first to France, then to Switzerland, where she lived quietly, probably wondering how life had gone so spectacularly sideways since that sunny wedding day. The epilogue. The curse outlives the kingdom. Their marriage technically survived, on paper, but emotionally it had long expired. They never divorced, because that would have been undignified. Instead, they lived apart for the rest of their lives, united only by tragedy and a shared photo album of things that exploded. Ana's sons inherited both her charm and her hemophilia. One died young from the condition, another was killed in a car accident. By mid-century, the Spanish monarchy looked more like a ghost story than a government. And yet, somehow, the family line endured. Ana's great-grandson, King Felipe VI, sits on Spain's throne today, still politely pretending the family history isn't one long chain of unfortunate events. As for Alfonso XIII, he died in exile in 1941. His final words were reportedly, "I am very bored," which feels fitting for a king whose life began in chaos, peaked at an explosion, and ended in a hotel room in Rome. The wedding that proved royalty doesn't mean safety. So that was the royal wedding that literally went up in smoke. It was supposed to symbolize peace, unity, and the bright future of Spain. Instead, it became a grim metaphor for everything about monarchy. Lavish, fragile, and one badly timed explosion away from ruin. It's also proof that even in the 20th century, royal weddings were still magnets for disaster. You can change the era, the fashions, even the mode of transport, but you can't escape the curse of history's worst wedding planners. Let's float on to another one. If you thought bombs and massacres were unlucky, wait until we drift backward again to a medieval wedding where the entire feast turned fatal. A royal banquet so cursed that the guests started dying before dessert was even served. Stay comfortable. In part 3, we'll glide softly into the Banquet of Blood, the 15th century wedding feast that poisoned a kingdom. Hey, you're still awake? Impressive. That means you've survived a wedding that got bombed, several royal bloodlines that shouldn't have been mixed, and at least one king who died of boredom. You deserve a nap. But before you drift off, let's wander quietly back a few centuries, to the mid-15th century, when royal weddings were less about romance and more about alliances, land, and serving questionable meat to hundreds of sweaty nobles. Tonight's story is sometimes called the Banquet of Blood, a celebration so cursed that guests began dropping dead before the musicians could finish their second song. We're going to Brittany, that foggy, damp corner of medieval France where politics, poison, and bad luck tended to share the same dinner table. So, dim the torches, loosen your doublet, and imagine the sound of 100 goblets clinking in a stone hall. It's time for another royal party gone terribly wrong. The setting: Brittany, 1440s, a region with too many dukes and too few friends. In the 1440s, Brittany was technically part of France, but practically its own little kingdom. It had its own dukes, armies, and feuds, and it mostly tolerated French kings in the same way one tolerates distant relatives at family reunions, politely but with visible discomfort. Our story begins under the reign of Duke Francis I of Brittany. He was young, handsome, and constantly paranoid, an understandable condition for anyone ruling a piece of land that France, England, and half of Europe wanted to invade on weekends. Francis had recently married Yolande of Anjou, a woman from one of France's most ambitious families. The union was meant to bring peace between two rival houses. Instead, it brought one of the strangest and most gruesome banquets in medieval memory. The feast: wine, venison, and very bad timing. The occasion was grand, possibly a wedding banquet, possibly a peace feast. It's hard to say, because medieval chroniclers weren't known for their clarity. But we do know that hundreds of nobles gathered in the ducal palace at Nantes. There was roast swan, glazed peacock, salted eel, and an unreasonable number of pies, because medieval people believed that if a dish didn't contain birds, fish, and pork simultaneously, it was probably unhealthy. Candles flickered against the stone walls. Musicians played slow, nasal tunes on shawms. Servants rushed about with trays of wine and steaming meat. And the Duke, radiant in silk, toasted to health, peace, and everlasting friendship. You can probably guess how that went. The sudden turn, when the guests began to fall. Somewhere between the third and fourth course, sources disagree, but after the eel pie seems popular, people began to feel unwell. At first, a few guests complained of dizziness, then nausea, then collapse. Within an hour, the banquet hall turned from celebration to chaos. Nobles were vomiting, fainting, gasping for breath. Servants screamed, the music stopped, and Duke Francis, realizing something was terribly wrong, had the tables cleared. Too late. By dawn, several prominent guests were dead. Others lingered for days in agony. The cause? Likely poison, a generous dose, slipped into the food or wine, delivered with the kind of subtlety only medieval chefs could manage. The theories. Who poisoned the party? No one ever confessed, of course, but that didn't stop the rumors. Some said it was a plot against the Duke himself, orchestrated by jealous nobles from Anjou or rival factions within Brittany. Others claimed the English were behind it, because when in doubt, blame England. And a few whispered that the Duchess Yolande might have been the real target, as her family's influence over Brittany made many enemies. There was even one theory, my personal favorite, that suggested the poison wasn't deliberate at all. Maybe the meat had just gone bad. Because nothing says royal feast like a side of medieval salmonella. Still, most chroniclers agreed it was poison, and deliberate poison at that. The banquet, meant to seal alliances, had instead torn the court apart in suspicion. And the Duke? He survived, but barely. For months afterward, he was said to suffer mysterious illnesses and fits of weakness. Probably psychological, possibly poison after effects, or maybe just the stress of realizing every future dinner could be his last. The aftermath. Brittany becomes a murder mystery. The deaths caused an immediate political crisis. Brittany's fragile peace unraveled overnight. Families demanded revenge. Servants were interrogated, tortured, and in some cases executed just to make an example. Because if you can't find the real culprit, at least find someone to hang. Chroniclers note that several nobles who'd been in the Duke's inner circle suddenly disappeared from public life, fled to monasteries, retired to their estates, or took ill themselves, which in 15th century terms usually meant we don't ask questions. The Duchess, meanwhile, retreated from public festivities entirely. No more feasts, no more banquets, just prayers, quiet meals, and probably an understandable distrust of dinner invitations. A parallel in Lithuania, the wedding that killed half the court. Now, while Brittany was dealing with its food-based homicide, a strangely similar story was playing out far away in Lithuania, because apparently the 15th century was a dangerous time to eat at royal weddings. This one involved the noble family of the Goštautas, a powerful Lithuanian clan. The event was supposed to be a joyous union between two important houses, held at Vilnius Castle, complete with roast boar, honey mead, and the usual medieval level of overindulgence. And, much like in Brittany, the guests started dying before dessert. Historians still debate whether this Lithuanian banquet disaster was caused by poison, spoiled food, or a terrible outbreak of disease spread through shared dishes and goblets. Either way, by the time the night was over, dozens of nobles were dead, including several members of the groom's family. So many died that chroniclers later referred to it simply as the cursed wedding. Royal feasts, it seems, were the medieval equivalent of Russian roulette, except with more wine and worse hygiene. Medieval banquets, germ warfare without the science. To understand how easy it was for these things to go wrong, let's take a sleepy little detour into medieval food safety, or the lack thereof. Imagine a kitchen with open fires, no refrigeration, and about 20 underpaid servants handling raw meat with their bare hands. The good old days. Royal banquets often lasted 6 or 7 hours, with up to 12 courses. Each course featured dozens of dishes: fish, game, poultry, pies, pastries, sauces, often served lukewarm and occasionally alive. It wasn't uncommon for a noble to die from food poisoning just by eating leftovers from yesterday's party. Add politics, ambition, and revenge into the mix, and you've basically invented the 15th century version of a murder mystery dinner. The Long Shadow: How the Banquet Changed the Duke's Reign. After the Banquet of Blood, Duke Francis I was never quite the same. He ruled more cautiously, trusted fewer people, and held fewer public feasts. Chroniclers describe him as melancholic, which, in polite historical language, usually means deeply traumatized, but still pretending everything's fine. His marriage to Yolande remained childless, which many saw as a divine punishment, or just bad luck, depending on how spiritual you're feeling. Francis died only a few years later, still young, leaving behind a duchy fractured by paranoia and grief. The banquet curse, as locals called it, seemed to linger for decades. Even future dukes reportedly avoided large gatherings, preferring small, private dinners with trusted company. A smart choice, really, especially if your enemies have access to arsenic. The medieval mindset, turning tragedy into superstition. Fashion: no disaster was complete without divine interpretation. Clerics claimed the banquet deaths were punishment for vanity and gluttony, because, of course, if you die mid-feast, it's not the poison, it's your moral failing. Chroniclers wrote long, mournful passages about how the nobility had grown too proud, too decadent, too fond of foreign spices. One even noted that the Lord smote the table of princes, for their hearts were fattened as geese before Michaelmas, which is poetic if you ignore the vomiting nobles in the background. The broader pattern: weddings and deaths hand in hand. You'd think that after a few of these incidents, royals might tone down the feasts, maybe just elope. But no. History is filled with cursed royal celebrations that somehow went on despite every warning sign. In Scotland, in 1566, Mary, Queen of Scots' secretary, was murdered during a dinner party. In France, the 1572 wedding of Henry of Navarre triggered the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands were slaughtered in the streets. And in Brittany, centuries later, people were still whispering about the Duke who toasted to peace and drank to death instead. It's almost poetic, in a grim, sleepy sort of way. Every royal attempt at unity seemed to end with a body count. The quiet ending, when the music finally stops. After the Banquet of Blood, life in Brittany slowly returned to its usual medieval rhythm: wars, taxes, occasional plagues. The story of the poisoned feast faded into legend, a cautionary tale murmured over candlelight. But it left behind a legacy that stretched across Europe: the uneasy realization that no amount of jewels or banners could protect royalty from their own dinner plates. For the people of Brittany, the tale became a dark bedtime story, told to warn children about greed, pride, and maybe just overeating. For historians, it became another example of how the thin veneer of royal glamour could hide something deeply rotten beneath. And for us, it's just another reminder that the past, for all its splendor, was mostly uncomfortable, unsanitary, and occasionally fatal, especially if you got an invitation to dinner. So that was the Banquet of Blood, the medieval feast that went from toast to tragedy in the time it takes to pass the salt. We'll let the candles burn low and the ghosts of that long-ago hall fade back into the stone. Next time, we'll drift a little further down the timeline to the early modern courts of Europe, where wedding disasters became slightly less bloody and a lot more humiliating. In Part 4, we'll softly unravel the wedding that cursed a dynasty, the tragic union of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Because if anyone could turn romance into revolution, it was those two. Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead and settle in, get comfortable, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket burrito if you haven't already, because tonight we're drifting back to one of history's most glittering and most cursed royal weddings. A union that was supposed to bring peace, stability, and a dash of Franco-Austrian friendship, but instead ended with the sound of a guillotine blade in the public square. Yes, we're talking about Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette, the couple who managed to turn a political alliance into one of history's longest, most awkward slow-motion train wrecks. Let's ease into it. It's May of 1770. France is in its pre-revolution sparkle phase. Versailles is still gleaming, powdered wigs are basically a competitive sport, and nobody's pretending that the peasants are doing fine. The French court is like an 18th century influencer house, rich, beautiful, and completely detached from reality. Into this world comes a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess, Marie Antoinette. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was basically the ultimate momager of European royalty. She had 16 children, yes, 16, and treated them like political chess pieces. Her mission? To marry them all off strategically, expanding Habsburg influence like a real-life version of Risk. So when France needed a new queen, Maria Theresa was thrilled. The Bourbon dynasty and the Habsburgs had been enemies for centuries. Endless wars, political feuds, bad press, the usual. But now there was a chance to patch things up with a marriage. Because in the 18th century, nothing says peace like marrying off your teenage daughter to your former enemy's awkward grandson. Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, was 15. Marie Antoinette was 14. Neither of them knew what they were doing, but diplomacy waited for no one. And so, in April 1770, Marie Antoinette left Austria forever. The journey was symbolic and humiliating in equal measure. She was literally stripped of all her Austrian belongings at the border, including her clothes, jewelry, and even her beloved dog, because nothing Austrian could cross into France. It was like a medieval version of airport security, but emotionally most. Worse. She stepped into France in a new gown, new jewels, and a new identity, the Dauphine of France. The wedding was held on May 16, 1770, in the Royal Chapel at Versailles. The guest list was, of course, ridiculous. Cardinals, dukes, duchesses, ambassadors, every noble with a title and a powdered face was there. The ceremony itself went smoothly. There were vows, rings, tears of joy, and at least 3 fainting courtiers overcome by heat and perfume. But outside, things were less charming. In Paris, a massive celebration was held for the people: fireworks, food stalls, and dancing in the streets. Unfortunately, crowd control was not exactly an 18th century strong suit. A firework went off the wrong way, startling horses and sending panic through the crowd. Stalls collapsed, people trampled one another, and chaos spread through the Place Louis XV. By the end of the night, over 130 people were dead. Some accounts say more than 300. What was meant to be a royal celebration turned into what Parisians grimly nicknamed the Wedding of Death. Not exactly the romantic start anyone wanted. Back at Versailles, Louis and Marie Antoinette were officially husband and wife, but famously, not exactly close ones. Their marriage remained unconsummated for the better part of 7 years. 7 years! Louis, who was shy, awkward, and more interested in locks and keys than romance, had no idea what to do. Marie Antoinette, equally inexperienced, was confused and lonely. They were 2 teenagers surrounded by scheming adults, whispering courtiers, and constant political pressure. The problem wasn't just their shyness. The Austrian alliance was unpopular in France, and Marie Antoinette became the perfect scapegoat. Every bad harvest, every economic crisis, every tax increase, somehow it was all her fault. She was foreign, frivolous, and had an unpronounceable accent. It didn't help that she enjoyed gambling, elaborate hairstyles, and expensive dresses. Rumors started to swirl about affairs, extravagance, and secret lovers. The press, even back then, had a flair for character assassination. Pamphlets circulated calling her Madame Deficit, accusing her of bankrupting France through fashion alone. In reality, she was far from the sole reason for France's economic woes, but perception was everything. And then there was the infamous diamond necklace affair, a scam that Marie Antoinette had absolutely nothing to do with, but that still managed to destroy her reputation. The public loved a villain, and she fit the role perfectly. Meanwhile, Louis XVI, bless him, was trying his best. He genuinely wanted to be a good king. He studied statecraft, reformed taxes, and even tried to support the American Revolution, hoping to undermine Britain. Unfortunately, he was about as politically agile as a sleepy walrus. The royal couple eventually had children, and for a time, things seemed better. But the tide of history was turning. By the late 1880s, the country was collapsing under debt, inequality, and hunger. The revolution was brewing, and the palace walls couldn't keep it out. In 1789, the storm finally broke. The people marched on Versailles, demanding bread and change. Louis and Marie Antoinette were forced to move to Paris, under guard. The world of silk and chandeliers was gone, replaced by angry mobs and revolutionary slogans. By 1793, the monarchy was no more. Louis XVI was executed first, in January, polite, dignified, apologetic to the end. Marie Antoinette followed 9 months later, pale and calm, her once elaborate hair shorn away. So, yes, the wedding that was meant to unite empires ended by wiping one off the map. It began with fireworks and ended with the fall of the French crown. But, in some strange, poetic way, The two teenagers from Austria and France did manage to change history, not through peace or prosperity, but through their downfall, which became the birth cry of a new world. And as the revolutionaries dismantled Versailles and everything it stood for, the legend of their ill-fated marriage grew. Part cautionary tale, part tragic bedtime story for the ages. Let's drift onward to our next tale, another royal gathering that managed to turn joy into disaster. Because apparently, history just can't resist ruining a good party. Hey again, sleepy historians. By now, you've probably realized that royal weddings have a, well, statistically suspicious connection with disaster. They promise harmony, peace, and a glittering future, and somehow they keep delivering explosions, revolutions, and occasionally the end of civilization as people knew it. So let's float gently into the early 20th century, the world of corsets, carriages, and imperial mustaches so grand they could have their own postal code. This one's about love, a rare thing in royal circles, and how that love managed to accidentally start a world war. Our story begins in the Austro-Hungarian Empire around the late 1890s. The empire was a sprawling, confusing patchwork of ethnicities and languages. Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Italians, all living under one very tired imperial umbrella. And sitting under that umbrella was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the throne. Now, Franz Ferdinand wasn't your typical fairy tale prince. He was serious, gruff, and often looked like he was in a permanent state of irritation, which, to be fair, he usually was. But beneath the heavy eyebrows and aristocratic scowl, he had a surprisingly tender heart, because he fell in love. Not with a princess, not with a duchess, but with Sophie Chotek, a lady-in-waiting from a lesser noble family. In royal terms, that was like a future king dating his personal assistant. Totally scandalous. Sophie was charming, intelligent, and quietly elegant. But in the rigid social order of the Habsburg court, she was a nobody. For Franz Ferdinand, though, she was everything. He pursued her relentlessly, defying the expectations of his family and the iron will of Emperor Franz Joseph, who was not amused. The emperor tried to forbid it multiple times. He told Franz Ferdinand to find someone suitable, but the Archduke refused. It became a full-blown imperial standoff. Eventually, after years of stubborn love, the emperor relented. Sort of. He allowed them to marry, but on one brutal condition. It would be a morganatic marriage. That meant Sophie would never be empress, their children would never inherit the throne, and she would have to walk behind every other member of the imperial family at official events. Basically, she was allowed to marry him, but reminded every single day that she wasn't good enough. And so, on July 1st, 1900, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were married in a small, private ceremony in Reichstadt, Bohemia. The imperial family largely boycotted it. Only a handful of loyal friends attended. There were no glittering crowds, no royal fanfare, just a quiet exchange of vows between two people who genuinely loved each other. It was, ironically, one of the few royal marriages that was actually based on love, and yet it carried the heaviest curse of them all. For the next 14 years, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie lived a semi-exiled existence. They had 3 children, retreated to their country home, and avoided the poisonous court politics of Vienna. They were happy, in a modest, quiet way. But history, as always, was lurking around the corner. In June 1914, they were invited to visit Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a province recently annexed by Austria-Hungary and a hotspot of political tension. The trip was meant to show unity, peace, and imperial presence, but it was also a terrible idea. Nationalist groups in the region were furious at Austria-Hungary's control. One group, the Black Hand, decided to make a statement, and unfortunately, that statement was assassination. On June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie arrived in Sarajevo. They rode through the streets in an open car, waving politely, unaware that multiple assassins were stationed along the route. The first attempt failed. A bomb thrown at their car bounced off and exploded under the next one in the procession. Franz Ferdinand, in true Stoic fashion, scolded his driver and continued with the day's schedule, because apparently, in royal circles, surviving a bombing attempt was just mildly inconvenient. Later that morning, the couple decided to visit the wounded from the blast at the hospital. But no one told the driver that the route had changed. He took a wrong turn onto a narrow street and stopped to reverse. Standing right there, by sheer coincidence, was a young Bosnian student named Gavrilo Princip. He was one of the would-be assassins from earlier that day. He pulled out a pistol, stepped forward, and fired 2 shots. Franz Ferdinand was hit in the neck, Sophie was hit in the stomach. Franz turned to her and whispered, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." But within minutes, both were gone. The world shifted that day, quietly at first, like a ripple in still water. Within weeks, it became a tidal wave. The assassination set off a chain reaction of alliances, ultimatums, and declarations of war that spiraled into the First World War, the bloodiest conflict humanity had ever seen up to that point. All because a man who loved his wife refused to stay away from a parade. The irony is unbearable in a slow, tragic sort of way. Franz Ferdinand's marriage had already caused a rift in his empire. His death, and Sophie's, tore it apart completely. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would not survive the war that followed. By 1918, it was gone, dismembered, dethroned, and forgotten. The grand palaces of Vienna grew quiet. The Habsburgs faded into exile. And buried together in a small chapel at Archstetten, Franz and Sophie finally rested side by side, equal in death.
Never could be in life. If there's any consolation, it's that theirs was one of the few royal love stories that was actually real, even if it cost the world about 20 million lives. So yes, the wedding that sank an empire wasn't cursed by arrogance or vanity, but by the one thing royal marriages rarely had: genuine affection. And maybe that's the saddest part. Let's drift gently onward, because our next tale proves that even when royal families try to outwit fate, fate still finds a way to RSVP to the wedding. Hey again, night historians. Still awake? If not, that's okay. Tonight's story is meant to drift you softly between fascination and fatigue, like a long carriage ride through dusty history. We've been through cursed fireworks, banquets of blood, guillotines, and the Sarajevo gunshots that launched a world war. You'd think by now that royal weddings would learn to tone things down. But no. So let's wander quietly back to Spain, again, where yet another wedding tried to celebrate love, only to end with mourning veils and funeral bells. Because in royal Europe, marriage was practically a gamble with fate. It's 1919. The world is still limping out of the Great War. The air smells faintly of gunpowder and exhaustion, but the monarchies that survived are desperate to look elegant again. Spain, neutral during the war, still holds on to its glitter. King Alfonso XIII, the same one who barely escaped the 1906 wedding bombing we talked about earlier, is still on the throne, and he's preparing for a family wedding. His sister, Princess Maria de las Mercedes, is finally getting married. Mercedes was beloved, cheerful, kind, and one of the few Spanish royals who seemed to genuinely like people. Her fiancé, Prince Carlo of Bourbon-Two Sicilies, was tall, dashing, and exactly the kind of man the newspapers liked to call gallant before that word went out of style. After years of loss and war, their marriage was meant to symbolize renewal, peace, stability, and a bit of romantic optimism. The Spanish court threw itself into preparations with the kind of nervous energy only post-war Europe could muster. The ceremony was set for October 12, 1919, Columbus Day, of course, because the monarchy loved a patriotic excuse for confetti. The Church of San Jerónimo el Real in Madrid was decorated with white flowers and golden ribbons. Crowds gathered along the streets, eager to glimpse the princess in her wedding gown. And for once, everything seemed fine, peaceful. But if there's one thing we've learned from centuries of royal history, it's that whenever someone says everything was fine, the universe gets ideas. Mercedes, radiant and smiling, walked down the aisle on her brother the king's arm. The organ played, the nobles dabbed their eyes. Spain sighed in collective relief. The wedding went perfectly. The curse, this time, wasn't in the church. It was waiting quietly in her lungs. See, Mercedes had been ill for a while, a lingering weakness from what was likely tuberculosis. The palace had downplayed it, pretending it was just fatigue, because royal families hated the idea that anyone might not be perfect. But by the time of her wedding, she was already coughing in private, pale beneath her veil. Still, she carried on, smiled through the ceremony, endured the banquets, waved to the crowds, and posed for photographs. In every image, she looks luminous. You'd never guess she was dying. A few weeks after the wedding, the newlyweds moved to the seaside, hoping the fresh air would restore her health. But it didn't. Her condition worsened quickly. She began to waste away, quiet, gentle, and resigned, like so many young royals before her. By December 1919, just 2 months after her wedding, the doctors told the family there was nothing left to do. Mercedes was 23 years old. Her husband, heartbroken, stayed by her side. She died softly, like a candle going out in a draft. The honeymoon barely over, the flowers from the wedding still pressed in her prayer book. The Spanish people were devastated. Newspapers printed her photograph draped in black borders. King Alfonso XIII, who had once survived his own wedding massacre, now stood beside his sister's coffin, wondering if the family was simply cursed. It's almost poetic in that tired, melancholy way that history often is. The girl who had lived through bombings, revolutions, and epidemics, felled not by scandal or assassination, but by an invisible illness no crown could cure. Her husband, Carlo, never truly recovered. He spent years living quietly, keeping her portrait on his desk until the day he died. The palace locked her wedding gown away in storage. The press called it the wedding that invited death. It sounded dramatic, of course, but in that old, weary monarchy, death always seemed to RSVP anyway. And maybe that's the thread running through all these royal weddings we've been floating through tonight. No matter how much gold they wore, no matter how grand the carriages or how many bells were rung, every celebration seemed shadowed by something unseen, a quiet reminder that power doesn't protect anyone from fate. The banquet ends, the fireworks fade, the carriage wheels stop turning, and what's left is just another name in the long, sleepy scroll of history. Let's drift one last time to our final story. The wedding, so cursed, so soaked in misfortune, that even its guests began to whisper they'd seen the devil in attendance. Imagine this: a cold December evening in Imperial Vienna. The year is 1881, and the streets are powdered with snow. Carriages clatter over cobblestones as elegantly dressed men and women glide toward the grand ring theater, their laughter fogging the frosty air. The city sparkles with anticipation. A new opera is premiering tonight. Inside, chandeliers blaze with golden light, velvet seats gleam, and the scent of perfume mingles with candle smoke and fresh varnish. No one suspects that this theater, a palace of beauty, is about to become a furnace. As the curtain rises and the orchestra begins its overture, a stagehand backstage strikes a match to light the gas lamps. It should have been routine, but something hisses, then snaps. A whoosh, a sudden burst of blue flame snakes upward, crawling along a line of gas tubing toward the stage curtains. Within seconds, the elegant drapes ignite, and the air fills with the crackle of burning silk. At first, the audience thinks it's part of the show, a special effect perhaps, but the heat grows unbearable. Panic ripples through the rows as the music halts mid-note. Smoke billows out, thick and black, swallowing the ornate balconies. The gilded ceiling glows red. People scream. The exits, those heavy, beautiful wooden doors, had been locked to prevent ticket fraud, and when they are finally forced open, the sudden rush of oxygen feeds the fire like a starving beast. Flames surge, devouring everything. The lights go out. In the suffocating dark, the crowd tramples itself trying to escape. By the time the inferno dies, nearly 400 souls are gone. The elegant gowns, the polished shoes, the pearls, all reduced to ash. The only music left is the crackle of embers and the soft hiss of cooling iron. Vienna mourned for months. The emperor himself ordered reforms. New safety laws, mandatory exit routes, flame-proof curtains. But even then, whispers lingered in the streets that the Ring Theater was cursed from the beginning, that the architect had defied omens, that workers heard ghostly wails before opening night. And sometimes, they say, if you walk past the site on a quiet winter night, you can still smell the smoke. You can almost hear applause fading into screams, a ghostly encore from the death walls that silenced Vienna's golden age.
Imagine a palace filled with candlelight. Crystal chandeliers shimmer like frozen tears over tables lined with silver goblets, polished mirrors, and towering arrangements of lilies. It is November 1894, and in the heart of St. Petersburg, a royal wedding takes place, one that should have been pure celebration. Tsar Nicholas II, the young, hesitant heir to the Russian Empire, has just married the radiant Princess Alix of Hesse, who will soon be known to the world as Empress Alexandra. She is delicate, shy, her blue eyes filled with devotion and uncertainty. Outside, snow drifts against the palace windows. Inside, warmth glows like a dream. But this wedding carries a shadow. Only a week earlier, Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, had died suddenly, his body still lying in state when the wedding preparations began. The empire demanded both mourning and celebration, and so the church bells tolled in confusion, half lament, half triumph. The guests feasted under candlelight, but the air was heavy, as if joy itself dared not breathe. The music swelled, glasses were lifted, and the new Tsar whispered to his bride, "We begin our reign under a sad star." Those words, it seemed, became prophecy. Years later, that same couple, once young and glittering, would stand in another dimly lit room, surrounded by their children, listening to the echo of boots on concrete. The laughter of that wedding night had long since faded into whispers of revolution. The empire built on snow and gold was melting into blood and silence. No orchestra played for them in their final hour, only the cruel rhythm of rifles. The dynasty that had toasted beneath chandeliers ended in a cellar beneath a house in Yekaterinburg. And so the last toast of the royal banquets was not to life, nor to love, but to an empire's final breath. The glasses were shattered, the crowns tarnished, the ballroom forever empty. The benediction. And now, dear listener, the banquet has ended. The halls are silent, the candles gutter low, and the ghosts of kings and queens drift among the echoes of waltzes that no one remembers. History feasts on beauty and the sorrow alike. It preserves them together, like wine turned to dust. Each story you have heard, every wedding that ended in ashes, every toast that becomes a requiem, reminds us that beneath every crown lies a heartbeat, fragile and fleeting. That love, no matter how royal, is never immune to tragedy. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, picture the ballroom fading into mist, the tables cleared, the chandeliers dimming one by one. The last violin sighs, the last candle dies. And the ghosts of the great and the doomed raise one final glass, not to power, not to glory, but to the quiet truth that even the brightest celebration can end in shadow. Sleep well, and may your dreams be gentler than theirs.